again with Nova to bring you the second chapter of Monster Punk Horizon Book 2, Isekai Skies. It's going to be coming out on November 18th and is already up for pre-order. So if you like to pre-order things, please do that. In the meantime, here's Chapter 2, and thank you for joining me this evening. Chapter 2, Surveys. Outside the gate, the relative civilization of Skull Harbor immediately gave way to the unsettled wildness of the jungle. Huge tropical trees towered over the land in bursts of teal, turquoise, and other bright blasts of color, thickened by the vines and hanging moss that crept through their canopies and between their trunks. The forest floor was similarly thick with bushy ferns and sprouting trees, except where the occasional monster fire had cleared the area, and those were even more occasional now than they'd been before. Pix pulled out her leather-bound logbook and turned to the most recent notes page. "We've been assigned sections A2 through F2 of the mid-coastal region," she reported from her scrawlings. "We're to record any Ignifex sightings, as well as burn sign, new nests, and eggs, as well as any territorial conflicts." "You know, we could just ask Harley to send her bugs to look for us," Jaz said. "It'd be much faster that way." "I don't want to be indebted to Harley any more than we already are," Pix said. "Besides, I'm not sure that her bugs can even comprehend the idea of numbers, at least well enough to be of use to us. They're just bugs, after all. Harley's the brain." Harley was otherwise known as the Harlequin Mantis, and was one of Jaz's friends, inasmuch as a giant eldritch mantis could be friends with a monster hunter. Though the caustic to javelin and a herd of raging buttlords had proven significant to the weakening the Screecher last month, Harley was almost single-handedly responsible for driving it off. Jaz had convinced her to team up with the hunters in exchange for some Screecher armor, but that didn't mean she was an ally. Eldritch monsters were among the most formidable creatures on the monstrous continent, and Pix didn't trust one who fought another Eldritch in exchange for a prize as simple as fashionable trinkets, especially when those trinkets were made from pieces she'd ripped off her enemy's body. Jaz might have trusted her, but then Jaz thought boob pockets were a good idea, or at the very least, knew they were a dumb idea, but went forward with them anyway. "I've also got shopping lists for various people in the market," Pix continued. "Axander wants honey and lemon garlic for a new brew, Chestifer needs some glist iron for the armory, Raoul needs herbivore dung for the garden, Moonoth preferred, and of course there are the nut pitches for Darla, so be on the lookout for all that during our survey. Sound good?" "Got it," Jaz said. "Yes, ma'am," Nova confirmed. Sasha shrugged. Today's wasn't glamorous work, Pix admitted, but it was the kind of work she'd come to the monstrous continent to do. Compared to the wondrous continent, which was settled and largely domesticated, the monstrous continent was a wild and untamed place, brimming with danger, secrets, and scientific discoveries to be made. The Society for the Exploration of the Monstrous Continent had been formed for the express purpose of making those discoveries, and while many of its members spent their time monster hunting, its true aim was research, data gathering, and general custodianship of the local ecosystem. Monster hunting, by comparison, was not one of its stated goals, but rather a necessary side effect of their presence here. Every so often, specific monster populations would grow large enough to disrupt the ecosystem and need to be culled. Occasionally, a single daunting monster would show up and wreak unnatural havoc, and every now and then, as with last month, skyborne monsters would fall and present their own unique threat. And then, of course, sometimes monsters would interfere with specific research, at which point they had to be either scared off or done away with. Monster hunts were rarely assigned as society business, though, except in dire situations, and most assigned tasks came down to surveying or gathering. Jobs that weren't assigned to specific hunters were posted on the quest board in the middle of Harbor Center, and people took them as they had time or needed the money or resources. Pix hoped to not have to kill any monsters today, though. She'd brought her capacitor blade because it was foolish to go into the jungle unarmed, but had no intention of taking it off her belt. That was what the cloaks were for. "Cloaks on, earworms in," she announced. The others reached for the respective earworm containers on their belts, slipped the creatures into their ears, and finally clasped their mantis gem-equipped cloaks around their necks. When the clasps connected, the four of them shimmered as if behind a heat distortion, all visual evidence of their presence soon obscured from view, at least from onlooking monsters. One of the lapidaries had recut their mantis gems last month to channel their invisibility magic more effectively, and as a result they could see each other's contours. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it at least made cooperating while invisible a lot easier and less dangerous. The earworms would help keep them invisible too. Mantis gems did nothing to dampen sound, but with earworms equipped, the party could communicate with what amounted to telepathy, so they wouldn't have to speak unless they wanted to. Those two giveaways taken care of, all they had to do now was make sure they trod carefully so their footsteps wouldn't draw attention. And for two naturally stealthy cats and two semi-experienced hunters, that was no challenge. Jaz might have been one of the loudest people in Skull Harbor, but most of her noise came from her mouth. When it came to physical maneuvering, she was quite nimble. Kits thus prepared, they began their day of surveying. Sacha set to work immediately, albeit on nothing that was on their list. The moment a particular telltale buzz tickled his ears, he unsheathed his weapon of choice and blasted toward the side of the noise, shredding through a wasp as big as he was with all the mercy of a professional assassin who moonlighted as a serial killer. A kinship with the Fratmen, a party of dedicated lapidaries who were enthusiastic about ridiculous gem-cutting experiments, led Sacha to be the owner of Skull Harbor's only set of rocket-powered twin blades, two Ignifex gem-equipped daggers that were as destructive as they were absurd, which made them perfect for a Catient who'd been hired by Jaz. You'd think we'd have cut a chunk out of the Waspa population, as many as we had to kill to make all the breaker pods last month, he muttered, blasting toward a second Waspa. We did cut a chunk out of the population, Pix replied. We haven't had to bring nearly as many paralysis remedies out since the Screecher. Waspas had a notorious reputation in Skull Harbor. Due to an unfortunate quirk of their biology, they produced so much paralytic venom that they could paralyze themselves if they didn't expel it, which led them to sting anyone and anything that came close. No one liked Waspas, except perhaps for that one hunting party who had named themselves after the monsters, but then they were just as annoying anyway, so the name fit. Sacha shrugged. Well, you can never have too few Waspas. F those guys. Mr. Sasha! Nova reprimanded again, but still stopped to carve and bag the Waspa corpses. Pix didn't mind Sacha's excess. They could use the venom as a natural paralytic if they wanted. Darla could also use it to brew her anti-paralysis ale, and there was no point in letting the kills go to waste. Plus, the more resources they gathered, the better, as long as they weren't actively harming the stability of the jungle. Besides, she expected today's to be light work anyway. Given the Screecher's recent culling of the Ignifex population, most of the data they were gathering would be on monster sign and egg sightings, rather than through close interactions, if they found any in this area at all. For ease of navigation, the Society had divided the jungle into regions and then divided it further into small blocks defined by latitude and longitude. The strip of land they'd been assigned to was outside typical Ignifex territory. Volcanic monsters didn't like to live next to aquatic areas, and so they'd be lucky to spot Ignifex sign at all. But patterns could change in a volatile environment like that under the dazzling skies, so the Society had ordered a complete survey of the jungle, just in case, so they could notice and act on a changing pattern before it became urgent, or, alternatively, to encourage it if it looked beneficial. Mundane though it was, Pix had leapt at the assignment. Nearly everyone here was a student of some vein of ecology or general life science, and Pix had studied landscape ecology, the relationship between an environment, its inhabitants, and the ecosystem they formed. Such relationships were Pix's thing, and she relished any chance to explore them. Jaz, by contrast, had whined about the academic nature of the assignment when Pix had chosen it, but then Jaz's expertise was more specialized and, frankly, accidental. She'd stumbled through university, changing majors until graduation time came, and it turned out she'd somehow amassed enough relevant credits to graduate with a degree in entomology. Jaz liked bugs, obviously. How else could one take enough credits to complete an entomology major by accident? But she thrived in adrenaline-fueled situations more than she did academic ones. That was why she and Sacha looked for tracks and kept guard, while Pix and Nova did the cerebral work. Got some monster sign, Jaz reported nearly as soon as they'd begun, and crouched by a line of three-toed, clawed tracks torn into the dirt. They were distinctive tracks, with frog-like bulges on the end of otherwise narrow digits, which were further tipped by deep, ferocious-looking indentations. The outer two claws of each toe were of a fairly standard size, but the print cut by the innermost toe claw suggested a ferocious raptor-like sickle, and the number of prints suggested a lot of them. Pirajka's on the field, Sacha observed. Pretty close, too. That's not surprising. This is Pirajka territory, Pix replied. but made a note of it in her book anyway. After all, data was data. You'll want to be alert with your paralily, Nova, just in case, she added. Yes, ma'am, Nova replied. She clenched the paralysis wand tighter in her paws. The Society classified monsters into different tiers by size: ambient, small, large, colossal, and titan, the latter of which was exceedingly rare and usually apocalyptic in the level of damage it could deal. Colossal monsters were less rare, and usually venerable variants of large monsters, which were the most hunted type. Small and ambient monsters were barely worth the effort and only hunted if they were causing tangible problems, except for the waspas, which everyone hunted because they were annoying. F those guys. Of the creatures the Society had classified as large monsters, Piranhas were the smallest and lowest tier. Roughly 3 feet tall and 3 feet long, they resembled large, sporty frogs with piranha heads and grisly, sharp teeth that looked like they belonged to some sort of deep-sea glowfish. Alone, they weren't much of a problem, but piranhas usually traveled in packs, and it didn't take many of them to strip an inattentive hunter to the bone before they could even grab their weapon. Fortunately, being amphibious monsters, they were vulnerable to electrical paralysis, which meant it would be easy to get through the day without killing any, even if they did attack. The party pressed on into the jungle, and the suns rose higher over the canopy. Occasionally they found some old skid marks left by an Ignifex's huge dragging belly, but for the most part they only ran into indifferent ocelots, irritable but disinterested lance vipers, and oblivious moonoths, munching happily on ferns and other forest floor debris. As they passed on, though, the recurring Piranha tracks began to take disproportionate hold of Pix's attention. There was something about them that seemed off, like there were too many, compared to the numbers she'd seen when she and Jaz had first started hunting. Some of them, too, seemed to have slightly different shapes, but it was hard to tell because the further inland they went, the deeper, more chaotic, and more ragged the tracks became. Suddenly Sacha pulled Pix from her ruminations. I hear nut pigeons ahead, he reported, ears quirking. Sounds like a decent number. Yes! Jaz roared. It was a deep, guttural exclamation, wildly disproportionate to her cadence announcement. She touched her wrist gem to her armor gem again, and then reached into the resulting portal to pull out her lure. Jaz's nut pidge lure was one of the stupidest things Pix had ever seen, and easily the stupidest piece of clothing Jaz owned, which for someone who owned bikini armor with boob pockets and extra-dimensional storage portals was a fairly high bar to jump. It looked like someone had taken a sock puppet, stuffed it so that it flailed unevenly whenever the wearer moved, and then sewn a simple caricatured dragon face on the closed end, complete with big button eyes and a mouth stitched with exaggerated X's. It wasn't even a special piece of clothing. The Society had given out the base pattern for it at one of its seasonal festivals, as a prize for completing some sort of scavenger hunt or gathering game. Pix couldn't even remember what festival it was at this point. Still, nearly everyone in Skull Harbor had won and customized one, and for several months after, one could not walk through the harbor without seeing legions of hunters in stupid floppy dragon heads strutting around and dancing for the sole purpose of doing so in stupid floppy dragon heads. Eventually, most hunters forgot the masks and returned to their usual scale of ridiculousness, but not Jaz. No, something about that mask resonated with the very core of Jaz's being. It called to the elder dragon inside of her, celebrated the rich, deep history of the bloodline that coursed through her veins and out through her very pointy and undeniably dragon-influenced ears, and she would wear it in devoted honor of that. So she said, anyway. Fine, Pix sighed. I guess we'll go ahead and get the nut pigeons out of the way. Jaz was already ahead of her. She bounded through the trees, found an appealing open area, and began to gather a pile of thick leaves, fallen branches, and other large debris. She had a strategy. She slipped the mask over her head and then plopped right down in the pile, covering herself so that only the dragon mask was visible, flailing majestically in a non-existent wind like the most obvious trap in the universe. But the thing that made nut pigeons a staple food? They really were that dumb. Pix didn't know what it was about the wiggly head, but something about it never failed to lure nut pigeons. The first fluttered over almost instantly and nuzzled its fat, gray bulk against the dragon neck as if it had found a new friend. It did not notice as the pile began to shift, as 2 leather-gloved hands eased out of the debris and snatched it with a swift, small, fatal snap. The bird sank into the pile, neck bent at an unnatural angle, as if the pile itself was devouring it. Pix had to hand it to Jaz. It was stupid, but it made quick, painless work of the birds. They met Darla's quota in no time at all, and soon they were back to the rest of their work. Pix had hoped to return to the Parajka tracks, but soon they came upon a Moonoth herd grazing in a clearing and figured they might as well check Raoul's quest off the list too. It was slightly monotonous, but that didn't bother Pix. This was what the average day was like working for the Society, wandering and finishing random quests until you ran out of quests or daylight. It wasn't particularly fast-paced, but she liked it, even if the work sometimes involved gathering piles of dung. The party set to work without complaint, even though Nova produced a pair of gloves to protect her dainty paws, and the job passed by with unsurprising speed. No one wanted to gather dung for any longer than they had to. You think there's any truth to today's human being purebred? Sacha asked, perhaps by way of distraction from the scent, perhaps because he was looking to refine his bet for later. Either way, it wasn't because he actually cared. I wouldn't know, Jaz replied. I haven't actually seen him. Not sure that I'd be able to tell, even if I did. Jaz was reclining on top of one of the vaguely bovine Moonoths, waiting for it to do more of its business. The monster didn't care. Moonoths were famously indolent creatures, and only survived in the numbers they did because the hunters actively preserved them. Their dung was the second best fertilizer on the entire continent, and necessary for garden production now that the Screecher had all but wiped out the Flapion, the bat-like source of the first best fertilizer. Why not? Nova asked, closing up her last bag. I think it'd be pretty obvious if he was made of bread. No, not the food, kiddo, Pix said as she followed a trail of tracks. Pure bread means there's no other species or breeds mixed in. Oh, that sounds boring, Nova replied. Why would it make them special? Because pure humans are said to have an incredible amount of luck, Pix explained, and that makes them really useful in lines of work like ours, if you believe in it. Frankly, given how many isekais have gone into the jungle and been eaten, I'm not sure how true it is. But that doesn't stop other hunters from getting excited about it. As long as I can win gems off them, I don't care what they are, Sacha said. I just need to know how to bet. Pix crouched by the latest patch of tracks. Jaz, what do you make of this? She called out. Jaz slid off the Moonoth's back and came to join Pix at the scuffed-up earth. Pack leadership fight? Jaz suggested. Could be that one pack developed 2 Parajkazards and they're beefing over who gets to be the great Parajkazard. These variant tracks aren't big enough to be Parajkazard tracks, though, Pix said, indicating the clearest of the variant tracks. Jaz pulled her goggles down over her eyes and set the lenses to magnify the area. It's too messed up, I can't tell the difference. Something's up, though, Pix said. It's not normal for this many Parajkas to get in this many fights. We should track some once we're done with our survey. Ugh, but I got a dude who's waiting for his goddess, Jaz groaned. This is more important than playing a prank on an isekai, Jaz. Fine, Jaz huffed, but if he wakes up before we get back, you owe me. Pix looked at the map in her logbook to reaffirm their location for her notes. They'd passed a distinct wyvernut tree some distance before they'd stopped to gather. The birdcage-like trees served as both field wyveraries and obvious landmarks for maps, so between that, the Moonoth pasture, and the increasing concentration of flam beehives, a favorite snack of the Ignifex, she'd determined that they'd made it to Section E2, which meant they were almost done with their main task for the day. The rest of E2 passed with relative ease, as did F2, the only real observations of note being the still curious increase in Parajka tracks and the discouraging lack of new Ignifex signs. They were on the very edge of Ignifex territory, so Pix hadn't expected an abundance of tracks, but she'd at least hoped for something that signaled a return to relative normalcy. More distinct tracks, ravaged bug mounds, or even, if they got lucky, a gem egg. Instead, all she found were more Parajka tracks. Enough that her mind began to wander as they continued their survey. Her mind wandered more than she liked to admit, but at least, she thought, it wandered for productive reasons. Jaz's mind wandered too, but her wanderings were usually preceded by a shout of, "Ooh, shiny!" after which she'd fling herself into willful distraction. Pix's mind, meanwhile, wandered not because it was distracted, but because it was full. Hers was a mind brimming with questions, and given the chance, they would spring out into the idle spaces of her brain and make her consider things like, why are we here, really? And what separates us from the monsters? The latter was a question with intriguing complexity, and one that frequently came up in the canteen, especially on nights when the hunters were feeling both pretentious and drunk on dragon ale. But every now and then, someone would ponder it seriously. Pix was one of those someones. There were many traits that clearly separated monsters from hunters. Appearances aside, the biggest of these was that the skies didn't automatically translate language for monsters like they did hunters and skyborns. Initially, Pix had thought it was because there was nothing to translate, because the monsters were intellectually incapable of something as complex as language. Truly, most were, but thanks to Jazz's goofery with earworms, they'd found that at least one, Harley, was capable of carrying a conversation on par with an intelligent hunter. Why, then, didn't the skies automatically translate her words if she was capable of intellectual thought? How many other intelligent monsters were going untranslated? That was easily one of the strangest mysteries of this world, stranger even than how the skies translated those words in the first place. Pix had no idea what kind of mechanism determined that, but then there was a lot they didn't know about how the skies worked. Most of the characteristics separating monsters from hunters were not uniform and consistent. She'd initially thought that size and ferocity were defining factors too, as she'd never met a hunter who was too big or too small to interact with the other members of civilized society. But some of the fiercest monsters, like the Pirajkas, were also some of the smallest, and some of the larger monsters, like the unfortunately named Raging Buttlord, were surprisingly gentle unless provoked. There was one rule that was consistent, though, and that was that monsters reproduced through gems. There was such an enormous variety of species among the hunters and skyborns that there was an equal variety of reproductive methods, but all of them somehow involved physical incubation. Some gave live birth, some laid eggs, some reproduced by budding, some just left seeds or spores everywhere when the weather was right. Monsters, by comparison, had a reproductive method that was wholly unique to them. Most would do whatever physical business was required to combine their genetic material, of course, but once that was done, the gestational monster, female in the case of Ignifex, would lay a little gem egg that then siphoned mysteric energy from its environment to grow until it reached hatching maturity. The childbearing monsters were generally vigilant about hiding their eggs in protected places, so they often weren't obvious in the landscape, except when fully ready to hatch. Pix had never seen a whole gem egg in the wild, though she'd seen remnants of hatchings, and hoped that she'd one day be able to observe a live hatching. That was when she saw the glint. An errant gust of sea wind shook the underbrush, and in doing so rustled the leaves of a thick fern far enough to let sunlight flash off something hidden underneath. "Oh, shiny!" Jazz screeched like a greedy seagull. She scampered over to the fern and lifted the heavy leaves to reveal a 2-foot-tall crystal cocoon. Nova left. Okay. Lost my place again. Okay. To reveal a 2-foot-tall crystal cocoon, its core swirling with conspicuous fluid and a shadow made of fat, unmistakably shaped flesh. An Ignifex egg. "Oh, finally," Pix sighed. She made a note of it in her logbook. It was close to cracking already. Pix could see the little disproportionate thing stirring inside the red crystalline fragments, as if waking up from a fitful sleep. "Let's watch it," she suggested. "I've never seen an Ignifex hatch before." Jazz crouched and pressed her face close to the shell as if she could see through it. "This isn't one of the babies that imprints on the first creature it sees, right? I've got enough responsibility without having to take care of a baby Ignifex. Jazz, you literally have no responsibility at all except to research Harley and pay off your student loans. And I'd like to keep it that way." "It's not an imprinter," Pix replied. "Besides, once it's hatched, we can sell the gem shell to Darla. It won't be as good as a mature Ignifex gem, but it'll still keep her cook fires going." "Fine," Jazz huffed again, then narrowed her eyes at Pix. "Wait, you're not watching this just to keep us from pranking that Isekai, are you?" "No, this is a legitimate part of our survey," Pix objected. "You know anything Hati does to him is going to be worse than anything I'll do to him, right? Hati will keep a prank going for days if she can. I don't have the attention span to do that." Pix had prepared a rebuttal, but for once Jazz had actually made a logical point. It may have been in service of her own prankish desires, but still, it wasn't wrong. "You're right," Pix admitted. "We watch this hatch, then we go back. Deal?" "Deal," Jazz agreed, and extended a fist bump to seal it. Their fists had barely bumped when a tiny crack spiderwebbed across the front of the egg. Inside, they could see the tiny Ignifex pecking its little beak plate against the gem shell until the crack widened, then split down the middle, and the baby monster spilled out of the shell and straight on to Jazz. "Oh, God, it's gooey," she exclaimed, immediately regretting that she'd worn so little armor to today's hunt. She picked it up off her lap and sniffed it. "Oh, good, it's just amniotic fluid. It's not the fire goo." The baby monster squirmed in her grasp and slowly cooed and opened its eyes. Adult ignifexes were not what one would call cute. They were fat, fiery salamanders with eyes that pointed in opposite directions and mucus-slicked skin that they set on fire whenever they felt threatened or pissed. Baby ignifexes were not what one would call cute either, but there was something about their exaggerated fetal proportions that made them feel like they should be cute. The creature's head took up a full 1/3 of its body. Its eyes stared out with wide pupils, still pointing in opposite directions like a chameleon's, but so deep and shiny that even Nova gave a little squeal. And its stubby little limbs flopped around as if it were a rag doll that had just gained sentience and was trying to figure out how to move. "You are the ugliest, most adorable thing I've ever seen," Jaz cooed. The monster barfed on her, ejecting the last of some gestational fluid. "Still adorable, still ugly," Jaz confirmed. "So do we just leave it here?" She tucked the creature under one arm, as if answering her own question, but then the jungle provided its own answer. A cacophony of watery, guttural-sounding snarls cut through the noise of the forest and silenced every ambient animal sound, so that all they heard was the thrashing of a pack of bodies tearing through the underbrush and growing closer. "Oh, snap, Pirajkas!" Pix exclaimed. "We can't let them find the hatchling. They'll eat it alive." Normally Pix wouldn't care. That was part of the life cycle of the forest, after all, and it wasn't her business to interfere with normal natural processes. But the Ignifex population was already in danger, and letting a pack of Pirajkas eat the newest Ignifex was a step in the wrong direction. "Weapons out," Pix commanded. "How am I supposed to fight with a baby in my armpit?" Jaz snapped. "Put it in your boobs," Sacha replied. "Oh yeah," Jaz realized, and then activated her vessel gem and shoved the little Ignifex backward inside the resulting portal. She didn't want to shove it into a dark, strange place so soon after it had emerged from another dark, strange place, though, so she left its head peeking out beneath her collarbone, and then snatched her greatsword from her back. "And you said this was a stupid idea," she prodded. "I said nothing," Pix replied. "You were thinking it." "I was." The hunters and Catians assumed their formation in a square, Jaz and her greatsword facing back, Pix and her capacitor blade facing forward, Sacha between them with his twin blades, and Nova opposite the old cat with her paralysis wand. The Pirajkas burst into view, hungry for the scent of the newly born Ignifex, and then thoroughly confused when they saw its disembodied head peeking out from the chest of a hunter. Nova saw their moment of confusion and sprang. However armored it might have been, Nova's billowing dress and flower-shaped wand gave one the impression that she was a delicate little bud of a kitten, too dainty to do anything but sit at tea parties and cry when things didn't go her way. That was absolutely not the case. Nova zipped so fast she became a sparkly blue blur, somersaulting over the monsters and tapping them with her wand in the most vicious game of leapfrog to ever be played. Every monster she touched collapsed to the ground, twitching uncontrollably, until she'd single-handedly taken out the whole pack of 7 Pirajkas. She landed daintily on her feet and bopped the largest with the back of her wand. "That'll teach you to stop eating babies," she reprimanded. At the same time, a startled cry burst from the baby Ignifex. A foreboding chemical smell began to rise from its skin, and instinct clicked the hard plates of its beak together. At once, the little Ignifex burst into flame, but Chaz didn't seem particularly bothered by the ball of fire pluming out of her chest, and it extinguished soon anyway, a shimmer of red passing over Jazz's body as the Ignifex's leather fireproofing attribute did its job. "Aw, baby's first fire," Nova cooed. "And you thought this armor was impractical," Jaz smirked, straight at Pix. "I'll concede that for this one exceedingly specific and still very stupid circumstance, yes, it was practical armor," Pix sighed, and then decided to turn her attention to more immediate concerns. Namely, the incapacitated Pirajkas. "Well, that's interesting," Pix commented. "You're telling me," Sacha said, sheathing his weapons. "I thought your cat was a little pansy, but that was impressive." "It's a lily," Nova corrected, and extended the lily-shaped bowl of her wand out for his observation. "No, I mean the Pirajkas. This is freshwater Pirajka territory," Pix elaborated. She indicated the twitching figures. "Freshwater Pirajkas are blue, green, and white, but these have a rust-colored streak. And look at their feet." Pix nudged the foot of the nearest Pirajka, which had distinctive webbing between its toes. "Freshwater Pirajkas don't spend as much time in the water and don't have this webbing. That's why some of the tracks looked different. These are saltwater piranhas. They're far from home, Nova said, worried. Pix nodded. Nova was right. Piranhas were unique among amphibious monsters in that they could live in both types of water. Their bodies would take time to transition, to accommodate the changes in their environment, but the change wouldn't kill them like it would most other aquatic monsters. Even so, they weren't migratory creatures. If they moved, it was because they felt threatened in their current environments, or else it couldn't support them. And a dark suspicion began to rise in Pix's mind. For the saltwater piranhas had fled the ocean, and that was where the Screecher had gone. And that is chapter 2. Thank you again for joining me tonight. Tomorrow night, I will be reading chapters 3 and 4, so please join me then. And again, thank you for watching.